The call came on a Tuesday morning in late October, just as the first real snow of the season was starting to dust the fields outside my kitchen window. I was standing at the counter with my second cup of coffee, watching the flakes come down over the back 40, thinking about my father the way I'd been thinking about him every morning for the past 8 months. Then my phone buzzed against the countertop and I saw my brother's name on the screen, and something in my chest went very still. I let it ring 3 times before I answered. Martin. That was all he said at first. Just my name, the way he'd always said it, flat, almost bored, like even the act of saying my name was something he was doing me a favor by bothering with. Derek, I'm calling to let you know that Dad passed away last night. He paused, and I could hear what sounded like traffic behind him, or maybe the TV. The service is going to be Saturday at McPherson's in Owen Sound. You're welcome to attend, obviously. I didn't say anything. There's something else. And here, his voice shifted just slightly, took on a quality I'd heard before, something self-satisfied and practiced. The way a man sounds when he's rehearsed what he's about to say several times in the mirror. Dad revised his will last spring. Everything goes to me. The property, the house, the accounts, all of it. I know that might be hard to hear, but he made his wishes clear, and I'm going to respect them. I wanted you to find out from me rather than from a lawyer. There was a silence. Martin, you there? I'm here, I said. So you understand the situation. I understand you perfectly, Derek. Another pause. I figured you'd have more to say about it. I'll see you Saturday, I said, and I ended the call. I set the phone down on the counter and picked up my coffee and stood there looking out at the snow for a long moment. Then I smiled, slow and quiet. The way a man smiles when something he's been dreading for a long time has finally arrived, and he realizes he's ready. My father, Harold, was 84 years old and had spent 60 of those years on the same 112 acres outside of Shallow Lake. He'd bought the property with my mother in 1963, the year after they were married, paid it off acre by acre over 20 years of hard work, and raised 2 sons there. My mother passed in 2019. Pancreatic cancer, quick and terrible, and after she was gone, my father rattled around that old house alone, and we all pretended it was fine because that's what you do in rural Ontario when a man in his 80s wants to stay on his own land. I'd been the one driving up from Barrie every second weekend. 200 kilometers each way, no complaints. I'd bring groceries, split wood, sit with him at the kitchen table after supper, and listen to him talk about the farm the way he always had, what needed doing in the spring, what the backfield might yield, what he thought about the neighbor's new drainage setup. He'd always been sharp, opinionated. He could tell you the price per bushel of canola in 1987 and what he'd paid for his first tractor to the dollar. He was lonely after my mother died, but he wasn't lost. Not then. Derek lived 40 minutes away in Collingwood, which should have made it easier for him to be involved. It didn't. Derek had always had reasons why things were difficult for him. A back problem, a project at work, something with his wife, something with the truck. He came around maybe 4 times a year and always left early. I didn't hold it against him, or I told myself I didn't, and I kept making the drive, and my father and I kept sitting at that kitchen table, and it was enough. Then, in the fall of 2024, my father started forgetting things. Small things at first. He'd ask me the same question twice in an hour. He'd start a sentence and lose the thread of it halfway through and look at me with something like confusion. Like a man who'd walked into a room and couldn't remember why. His doctor in Owen Sound, a kind woman named Dr. Reyes, who'd known him for 15 years, told me it was early-stage vascular dementia, treatable in the sense that we could slow it, not reversible. I told Derek the same week I found out. I sat in my truck in the parking lot of the Timmy's in Barrie and called him and explained what Dr. Reyes had said, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, I've actually been thinking about this. I think the right move is for me to go stay with him for a while, help him get organized. And something about the way he said organized made me feel uneasy in a way I couldn't quite name yet. I said that sounded good. I said we should coordinate. I said I'd still make the drive every 2 weeks. What I didn't know, what I had no reason to know yet, was that within 3 weeks of that conversation, Derek had moved himself and 2 suitcases into my father's house and started changing things. The first sign was small. I called my father one evening in November, and he seemed distracted, kept answering in short sentences, and in the background I could hear Derek's voice saying something I couldn't make out. When I asked my father if he wanted me to come up that weekend, he said, "Derek thinks it might be better if you give us a bit of space while we get settled." Us. Like the two of them had become a household. I called Derek afterward, and he explained, in the patient and slightly condescending tone he'd been developing since adolescence, that the constant back and forth was confusing for Dad. That consistency was important for someone in his condition, and that he'd talked to Dr. Ray's. This turned out to be a lie, but I didn't know it yet, and she agreed that reducing outside stimulation was best for now. I want to say I pushed back hard. I want to say I saw through it immediately. But the truth is that dementia care is terrifying and bewildering, and when someone presents themselves as having a handle on it, there's a part of you that wants to believe them, because the alternative that something worse is happening is almost too heavy to look at directly. I gave it 3 weeks. I called every few days, and my father sounded thinner somehow, more distant, and Derek was always there in the background. When I said I was coming up for Christmas, Derek told me Dad was having a hard stretch, and Christmas was going to be low-key, just the two of them. I drove up anyway, unannounced, 2 days before Christmas. Derek answered the door, and the look on his face, when he saw me standing on the porch, was the look of a man calculating something quickly behind his eyes. He recovered fast and smiled and let me in, and there was my father in his armchair by the wood stove, thinner than I'd seen him, quieter. But when he looked up and saw me, his face changed completely. He reached out and gripped my hand and held onto it and said, "Martin, I thought you weren't coming." We sat together for 2 hours. Derek hovered in the kitchen. My father asked me about my daughter, about my garden, about things we'd talked about months before, and occasionally the thread would slip and I'd see him search for it. But he was there. He knew me. He was glad I'd come. When I left that evening, I sat in my truck at the end of the laneway for a long time, with the engine running and the heat on, and I thought about what I'd just seen, not my father's decline that I'd been preparing for. What I thought about was Derek's face when he'd answered the door. That quick calculation, that almost imperceptible flicker of something he didn't want me to see. I drove home, and that night I called Frank Turcott. Frank was my father's nearest neighbor, had been for 30 years. He farmed the property east of my father's, soybeans and corn, and he and my father had a friendship built on a shared fence line and 40 years of knowing each other's business the way rural people do. He was a few years younger than my father, in his late 70s, still sharp, drove a red half-ton that had seen better days. I asked Frank to keep his eyes open and call me if anything seemed off. Frank didn't ask me to explain. He just said, "Yeah, I already had a feeling, Martin. I already had a feeling." And he told me that over the past 2 months, he'd noticed my father's truck hadn't moved, that the lights in the house were on different patterns than usual, and that one afternoon he'd seen a dark-colored car he didn't recognize parked in the yard for several hours. That was when I started writing things down, not frantically, methodically. I'm 63 years old, and I spent 37 years as a licensed electrician, and if that career teaches you anything, it's that when something isn't working, you document, you trace the circuit, you find out exactly where the failure is before you start pulling wires. I got a notebook, a real one, paper, nothing digital, and I started writing down every phone call, every visit, every conversation, every date and time, and who said what. I kept the notebook in my glove box. I also called a lawyer in Owen Sound named Patricia Swain. She'd done the work on my mother's estate, and I trusted her. I told her what I'd observed and what I suspected, and she listened carefully, and then she said, "Martin, I want you to come in and sit down with me, because there are some things we need to talk about." I drove up that same week. Patricia was a small, precise woman in her early 50s with reading glasses on a chain and a manner that was both warm and entirely serious. She explained to me the legal landscape very clearly. She said that under Ontario law, financial exploitation of a person with diminished capacity constituted elder abuse and was actionable. She said that if my father had signed any documents, a revised will, a power of attorney, any transfer of property after the onset of his dementia, those documents could potentially be challenged on the grounds that he lacked the legal capacity to consent. She said the key was documentation and evidence of his cognitive state at the time of signing. She also said something else. She said that if Derek had pressured my father to sign anything, or had used his position as a caregiver to manipulate him, that crossed into criminal territory. That was not just a civil matter. I asked her what I should do. She said, "Keep visiting, keep that relationship, document everything, and get me a copy of the current will, the one your father made with your mother when she was still alive, so we know what we're comparing against." I had a copy at home. I'd always had a copy. My father had given both his sons a copy back in 2018 when he and my mother had updated everything, and that will had divided the property equally between Derek and me, with certain provisions for grandchildren. I scanned it and sent it to Patricia the same afternoon. The months that followed were some of the hardest of my life, and the strangest, because I was holding two things at once that don't sit easily together. I was worried sick about my father, genuinely afraid for him, missing him, grieving him in a way that happens before death when a parent starts to slip away, and at the same time I was doing something cold and deliberate and necessary, building a case like a man, laying a foundation in the dark. Frank Turcotte became my eyes when I couldn't be there. He'd call me 2 or 3 times a week with small observations. The grocery delivery truck coming at odd hours and Derek loading boxes out of it himself, not letting my father answer the door. The one time Frank had dropped by on a pretext to return a tool he'd borrowed a year ago, and Derek had stepped outside to talk to him instead of letting him in, and Frank had caught a glimpse of my father through the window, sitting alone at the kitchen table looking at his hands. I pushed for visits and Derek resisted, always with reasons, always plausible ones. Dad was having a bad week. The doctor had suggested limiting visitors. The routine was fragile right now. Each time I pushed back, I drove up anyway. And each time Derek let me in because he couldn't exactly bar the door to a man's son. And each time my father gripped my hand and held on. In February, I noticed that my father's reading glasses were different. It's a small thing to notice, but I knew those glasses he'd worn the same style for years, wire-framed, bought at the drugstore in Owen Sound, and the ones on the side table that day were different. Thicker frames, darker. I didn't say anything. I wrote it down. In March, my father asked me where his watch was. He'd worn the same watch for 40 years, a Seiko my mother had given him on their 20th anniversary, scratched and faded and worth nothing financially but everything else. He said he'd had it on his wrist and then it was gone, and when he'd asked Derek about it, Derek had told him he must have misplaced it. He asked me if I'd seen it. I hadn't. I wrote it down. In April, Patricia called me. She'd done some quiet digging through the land registry, and she had news. The property had been transferred. In February of that year, my father had signed a deed of gift, transferring the 112 acres, the house, the outbuildings, the land to Derek, for the consideration of $1. In addition, she'd found that a new will had been filed through a solicitor in Collingwood, a man whose name she gave me, signed in the previous November. That will left everything, the property, the contents of my father's accounts, a life insurance policy to Derek, with nothing to me. I sat in my car outside my house and stared at the steering wheel for a long time after she told me this. Then I asked her what we did next. She told me she was filing a challenge with the court on the grounds of undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity. She said she'd already been in contact with the Office of the Public Guardian and Trustee, and she said she had a colleague who worked with the Ontario Provincial Police on elder abuse cases, and she thought it was time to make a call. I said, "Patricia, I need you to know one more thing." I told her about the notebook. I told her about Frank. I told her I had dates, times, observations, going back 8 months. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Bring me that notebook." I drove to Owen Sound the next morning. The following weeks moved in 2 registers simultaneously. On the surface, nothing had changed. I still called my father every few days. I still drove up every 2 weeks. Derek still answered the door with that controlled expression and let me in and hovered in the kitchen. My father was thinner, but he was still there, still knew me, still talked about the farm, still asked about my daughter, still reached for my hand. Underneath, things were moving. Patricia had filed in court her assessment, backed by Dr. Reyes's medical records, which confirmed that my father's dementia diagnosis predated the November will and the February transfer by several months, was that he had lacked the legal capacity to execute either document. Meaningfully, Dr. Reyes, when contacted, was unambiguous. She said that in her professional opinion, by November of last year, my father was not competent to make complex financial decisions without significant support, and that she had never spoken to Derek about limiting my visits. She said she'd been concerned about the situation for some time. The OPP officer Patricia put me in touch with was a woman named Sergeant Howe, out of the Owen Sound Detachment, who specialized in financial crimes against seniors. She was direct and unhurried, and she asked me very specific questions about what I'd witnessed and when. I gave her a copy of the notebook. She thanked me, gave nothing away, and told me to continue what I was doing and call her if anything changed. In September, I called my father, and Derek answered his phone. I asked to speak to my father. Derek said he was resting. I said I'd wait. There was a pause, and then my father came on the line, and his voice was thin, and there was something in it I hadn't heard before. Not confusion exactly, but a kind of effortful quality, like a man choosing his words very carefully under observation. He told me he was fine. He told me the weather had been nice. When I said I'd like to come up that weekend, he paused and said, "That would be fine, Martin. I'd like that." I heard Derek's voice in the background, low and unintelligible, and then my father said, "Derek says maybe next weekend would be better." I drove up Saturday. Derek met me at the door, and we stood on the porch for a moment in the thin September sunlight, and he looked at me with that calculating expression and said, "Martin, I want to be straight with you. Dad has made his wishes known. He wants stability. He's asked me to be the primary point of contact for his care. I think you need to respect that." I said, "I'm going to see my father, Derek." He let me in. My father was in the kitchen, sitting at the table the way he always sat. And when I came in, he looked up, and there was something in his eyes, relief, I thought, or something close to it. I sat across from him, and we talked for a while, and I asked him, carefully, whether he was happy with the way things were, whether he had what he needed, whether he felt he was able to make his own choices. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Martin, I want to come home." I said, "You are home, Dad." He shook his head slowly. I want things to be the way they were, before." He looked down at his hands. I signed things. Derek told me it was just paperwork. He said it was for the taxes. He looked up at me. I think I made a mistake. I reached across the table and took his hand. Derek was in the next room. I could hear him, deliberately not listening too hard, and I kept my voice quiet and steady. I said, "You didn't do anything wrong, and I'm going to take care of it." He held onto my hand for a long time. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday morning in mid-October, Patricia called me and said, "It's happening tomorrow." The OPP had enough. Between Dr. Reyes's records, the notary who'd facilitated the November will who, when interviewed separately, had expressed concerns about the circumstances of the signing that he hadn't voiced at the time, but had documented in his own records, and the Collingwood solicitor who, under pressure, had admitted that he had not conducted an independent capacity assessment before processing the deed transfer, and Frank Turcotte's sworn statement, and my notebook, and a forensic accountant Patricia had engaged, who had found that $47,000 had been moved from my father's savings accounts to a joint account Derek had opened in both their names and then transferred to Derek's personal account. Between all of that, Sergeant Howe had what she needed. Patricia said there would be a welfare check at the house the following morning. She said I should be nearby, but not at the property. I drove to Owen Sound that night and stayed at a motel on the edge of town, and I didn't sleep much. I lay in the dark and thought about my father at that kitchen table, and about my mother, who had worked beside him for 50 years on that land, and about the watch that had disappeared, and about my brother's voice on the phone in October, saying you're welcome to attend to my father's funeral, like I was a distant acquaintance being offered a courtesy. At 7:15 Friday morning, I got a call from Patricia. She said it was done. I drove to the property. When I turned off the county road and came up the laneway, there were two OPP cruisers parked in the yard, and Frank Turcotte's red half-ton pulled up near the fence. And Frank was standing by it with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching everything with the particular watchfulness of a man who has been waiting a long time for something to be made right. Derek was standing by one of the cruisers with an officer, and he saw me get out of my truck, and the expression that crossed his face in that moment, I'll carry it for a long time. It wasn't just surprise. It was the expression of a man who has been absolutely certain of something for months and has just had the floor pulled out from under him, and he's falling, and he can't understand how. He said my name just Martin, the same flat way he'd always said it. I walked past him toward the house. My father was sitting at the kitchen table with a female officer and a woman from the public guardian's office who'd driven up from Toronto. He was still in his pajamas, and his hair was uncombed, and he looked confused and tired and old, the way people look when they've been woken early and something large and difficult is happening around them. But when I came through the door, his face did what it always did. It opened. He reached out. I sat down next to him and took his hand and said, "I'm here, Dad. It's okay. I'm here." He gripped my fingers and didn't let go for a long time. Derek was charged that afternoon. The specific charges were criminal fraud, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult under the Criminal Code of Ontario, and breach of fiduciary duty. Sergeant Howe explained them to me later in the parking lot of the Owen Sound detachment, reading them off a printout in her careful way. The fraudulent will, the property transfer executed when my father demonstrably lacked capacity, the $47,000 moved from his accounts without authorization. She said the DA was also looking at the potential for a charge of criminal negligence, given what the welfare assessment had found about my father's living conditions and the withholding of medical visits, though she couldn't confirm charges until the process ran its course. Patricia had the deed transfer reversed within the week through the court application she'd filed months earlier. The fraudulent will was voided. My father's original will, the one he and my mother had made together in 2018, was reinstated. The property came back to where it had always belonged to my father, who was alive and being cared for properly, and who still knew, on good days, every inch of that 112 acres. I moved up to Shallow Lake that winter. I rented a place 10 minutes from my father's property and started driving over every morning. We fell back into a version of the old routine coffee at the kitchen table, talking about the farm, talking about my daughter, talking about my mother. The dementia kept progressing, the way it always was going to, regardless of anything either of us did. But he was fed and warm and cared for by people he trusted. And when he looked up and saw me in the kitchen doorway, his face did that thing it had always done. Frank brought the watch back in November. He'd found it in Derek's truck. Derek had parked in Frank's yard once, months ago, and Frank had noticed it on the seat and taken it without saying anything, not sure what he was doing, only sure that it wasn't right. He handed it to me, wrapped in a piece of flannel, and I drove straight to my father's and put it on his wrist, and he looked down at it for a long time. "Your mother gave me that," he said. "I know, Dad. I thought it was gone. I know." He turned his wrist slowly and looked at the scratch across the face, the one he'd gotten when the baler broke down in the summer of 1991, and he smiled. There's a thing that happens when you've been carrying something heavy for a long time, and it's finally over. It doesn't feel the way you imagine it will. It's not triumphant. Exactly. It's quieter than that, more like the feeling after a long winter, when you walk outside one morning and the air has changed, and you understand in your body, before you think it in your head, that something has shifted, that the worst is behind you. I had driven that county road back and forth so many times in those 8 months that I knew every turn, every frost heave, every stand of maples at the corners of the fields. I knew the way the light fell on the back 40 in the late afternoon, copper-colored, the way it always looked in October. I knew the sound the gravel made under my tires turning into the laneway. My father had built something real. He'd built it with my mother, acre by acre, year by year, the way people used to build things slowly, without shortcuts, trusting that if you did the work honestly, the thing would last. What my brother had tried to do was take that and make it mean something it was never meant to mean. He'd looked at my father's life and seen a transaction. People ask me sometimes whether I feel sorry for Derek, whether I wish things had gone differently. I think about that. Derek is 60 years old, and he's waiting for a trial date, and the life he had in Collingwood has been dismantled pretty thoroughly by the proceedings, and some part of me that I won't entirely suppress remembers who he was at 10 years old, running through the South Field, my little brother, before whatever it is that turns a person into what he became had fully taken hold. But then I think about my father's face, the morning the officers were in the kitchen, and he was confused and cold and hadn't slept, and his hair was uncombed, and the look in his eyes that wasn't just confusion. It was the look of a man who had been alone with something frightening for a long time, and had almost stopped believing anyone was coming. And then I think of Patricia reading through my notebook at her desk, making small notes in the margins, and Sergeant Howe with her printout in the parking lot, and Frank Turcotte standing by his red truck at the edge of the yard with his hands in his pockets, and Dr. Reyes, who had known my father for 15 years and said clearly and without hesitation what she knew to be true. And I think about all the mornings I got up before 6 and drove 200 kilometers up the highway in the dark because my father was alone and I needed to see with my own eyes that he was okay, and all the pages in that notebook, and all the phone calls with Patricia, and all the long, quiet evenings in that motel room in October when I lay awake, going over everything, checking the circuit, tracing the failure, making sure I hadn't missed anything. My daughter asked me once, sometime in the middle of all of it, whether I ever doubted myself, whether I ever wondered if maybe I was wrong about Derek and the whole thing would turn out to be a misunderstanding. I told her the truth, which is that I doubted myself constantly. That is the nature of doing something difficult and necessary. You don't do it without doubt. You do it despite it, one careful step after another. She asked me how I kept going. I thought about my father's hand gripping mine across the kitchen table in September. I thought about him saying, "I want to come home." I said, "That was easy. He needed me to." The farm is still there, the 112 acres, the house, the outbuildings, the back 40 where the light goes copper in the afternoon, the fence line that borders Frank's property, the kitchen table where my father and mother sat for 60 years. This past spring, I planted the kitchen garden the way my mother always had tomatoes along the south wall, beans in 3 long rows, a section of perennials she'd put in back in the 90s that kept coming back every year no matter what, the way certain things do. My father stood in the garden doorway one afternoon and watched me, and I could tell from his expression that he knew where he was, fully and completely, which doesn't happen every day anymore. He said, "Your mother would be glad you're here." I said, "I know, Dad." He stood there a moment longer, leaning in the doorway in the April sunlight. "I want you to know something, Martin." I said, "What's that?" He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the rows, and then he said, "I always knew you'd come." I went back to my work and didn't say anything, and after a while he went back inside, and I could hear him through the screen door, making his way to the kitchen table and settling into his chair the way he always settled. A little creak of wood, a little exhale. The fields were green and the sky was wide, and somewhere on the county road Frank's truck went by, and I knelt in the dirt of my mother's garden, and I let myself be there completely, without the notebook, without the drive back to Barrie, without the weight of the months behind us. Just the land that my parents built, and the work of keeping it, and the smell of the spring soil turning under my hands. That's the thing about a family home, the real kind. It isn't a transaction. It isn't a sum of money, or a line in a registry, or a piece of paper signed in a lawyer's office. It's the fence your father walked every spring. It's the garden your mother replanted every April. It's the kitchen table where a man gripped your hand and held on. It's the light on the back, 40 in October, copper-colored and lasting. It doesn't belong to whoever gets their name on the deed. It belongs to whoever shows up, and I showed up